fit here to discussion tab. We're here today for a really wonderful discussion and conversation. And thank you all for coming. Can you hear me well? So, my talk today will focus on Hannah Arendt's ideal of Jewish pariah. And the model is developed in the 1930s in Arendt's biography of Rachel Varenhagen. Rachel was an important German Jewish writer and the hostess of one of the important columns of the 19th century. And the pariahs are social and religious outcasts, and Arendt believed that the pariah should be an ideal for Jewish modern Judaism. And she revisits the pariah during the Second World War in her 1944 essay, The Jew as a Pariah, the tradition, and later in The Origins of Towsonism, and that's about it. Now, I have it. So, how am I doing that? So initially, Arendt did not intend to write about the pariah or even about Judaism. Her dissertation was about St. Augustine's concept of love, and she wanted to write her habilitation schrift on German Romanticism. However, during her research, she came across a trove of letters on Arendt, of Varenhagen, and she was considered by many as a popularizer of German Romanticism. And this led Arendt to take on the job of writing her biography. And Arendt completed most of the manuscript by 1933 in Berlin. However, due to her arrest in the spring of that year by Germans for her association with the German Zionist organization, Arendt had to flee Germany with her mother. She finished the book only in 1938 in her Paris exile. However, the book will be finally published in 1957 and in English. Now, Arendt is clear from the very beginning that the Varenhagen biography is in fact a work on Jewish assimilation, or better off, the failure of, or the crisis of. In the preface to the book, she admits that, I quote, the present biography was written with an awareness of the doom of German Judaism. And Arendt believed that Nazism proved the futility of Jewish assimilation. In an essay from 1933, she writes that it was clear that with the ascension to power of Hitler, Jewish assimilation came to an end. And elsewhere, she announces that it was time to declare its bankruptcy. And years later, she even confirmed to Karl Jasper's mentor that the book was written from the perspective of Zionist critique of assimilation. Rachel Varenhagen, who was born in 1771 to a wealthy Jewish Berliner family, would become over the years a symbol of Jewish assimilation. She converted to Christianity prior to her marriage in 1814, and her last words on her deathbed, with which Arendt actually opens the book, testify to her lifelong grappling with her Jewish past. This is how Rachel said, "The thing with which all my life seemed to me the greatest shame, which was the misery and misfortune of my life, having been born a Jewess, this I should on no account now wish to have missed." So Arendt, I would like to suggest, think of the pariah as a solution to this crisis, but it's going to be a very strange solution. Like in Gerard Schimmel's The Stranger, Arendt's work suggests that the pariah as a new Jewish or new human type, this is how she terms it, human type, which she exposes from the Jewish history. And I would like to consider for one moment the outline of the argument. And I really thank Chagi and you for kind of like giving us an outlook of what is a crisis, because I'm going to build on that in a moment. So historically, the term pariah was assigned to the lower caste of southern India. It is thus typically defines the undesirable state of being personally despised or socially rejected. Max Weber used this term to define Jewish history. The Jews, they claim, are the pariah people, unwanted, despised, and in many ways unlawful. And Arendt will build on her early work on the Jewish people from this perspective. She will think of the Jewish people as pariah people and would suggest, as I will show momentarily, how individuals could and indeed should take ownership of this social and political position. Now, what is important to remember is that Arendt is not the only one to try this theoretical maneuver in the 20th century. Jewish thought. I already mentioned similar, but many others did the same. So they found in Jewish history, especially in the crisis that the Jewish people experienced, as an entry point to think of modern Judaism. That is, crisis was a conceptual structure that grounded the discussion about Judaism or the Jewish people in the present. Think for another example of Franz Rosenzweig, and his attempt to offer a messianic model that is based on the fact that Jews did not have a living land or a living language or a living law. Or Hermann Cohen, who declared that the ethical function of the Jewish people is based on their suffering. And Emmanuel Levinas, I think, is another figure. And there are others. So what I would like to suggest is that crisis is an important trope of modern Jewish thought. Maybe not only modern, but I will limit myself to the discussion of modernism today. And it is with and through crisis that many think of Judaism, even the essence of Judaism. That is, if what we would have expected to find is an attempt to avert a crisis, to solve it. In modern Jewish thought, crisis seems to capture something intrinsic about Judaism. They are the people who experience crisis, not because of tentative reasons, but because of crisis is foundational in some way to them. It is their hidden truth. And Sholem's understanding of Tzimtzum comes to mind in this sense, and I'm specifically saying Sholem understanding, not Tzimtzum. Because what Sholem says, and I think this is his reading, that the symbolic meaning of Tzimtzum in Lorraine Kabbalah is that God is in exile. Not only the Jews are in exile, but God is also in exile. The crisis of Jewish exile becomes, in that sense, a cosmological fact. Maybe the most important cosmological fact. And I would like to just mention that all this does to our understanding of crisis. Crisis in this line of work is not an event with a beginning and an end, but the way of life, an enduring foundational dimension of experience, even of the world. Now, Zionism in this context is an outlier. Zionism sees Jewish history as 2,000 years of crisis. Think about that, 2,000 years of crisis. This is really interesting. However, in difference from what I just suggested, in Zionism the crisis calls for a solution. The main claim is that this crisis is indeed a crisis in the traditional sense that we talked about right now. A tentative historical reality with a beginning and an end, and most importantly, one that requires a solution, one that demands an answer. So to be very provocative, and I feel that we can be now at this stage, I would say that if you would like to think of Zionism in the context of Jewish thought, it's the emergent question that through which we can think about Zionism is, what is the crisis? Is this crisis is call for an answer, something to solve, or is this crisis is emblematic of Judaism? And that's kind of like the way we position the entire discussion in Jewish thought around Zionism. Now, Arendt, I would argue, shares the intuition of Sholem and Rosenzweig and Cohen. For her, the pariah condition of the Jewish people is foundational. She even argued that the pariah condition should be understood as an ethical Jewish ideal. One should be a pariah. What was initially an historical crisis is in Arendt an ideal to follow. So what I would like to do today is to think with you of different ways Arendt think of the pariah as possible entry point to think of crisis. Arendt will be my case study, so mostly. And I'm interested in, especially in thinking of two basic questions. I'm really opening them for us to think while I'm talking. So first one, and if a crisis stops to be a crisis. When Rosenzweig and Cohen internalize the Jewish crisis, is it still a crisis? Or put otherwise, does a crisis need a beginning and an end, like in the Zionist take on the Galut? And second, what are the different ways to relate to a crisis? I'm thinking specifically about passivity and activity, accepting crisis as insurmountable fact, and the other working in, through, and sometimes against crisis. So, as I noted, Arendt discusses the pariah first in her Weinhagen book, where she introduces her key distinction between the pariah, Jewish Parvenu, and the Jewish pariah. And these are her words. As a Jew, Rachel had always stood outside, had been a pariah, and discovered that at last, most unwittingly and unhappily, that entrance into society was possible only at the price of lying, of a far more generalized lies than simply hypocrisy. She discovered that it was necessary for the Parvenu, but for him alone, to sacrifice every natural impulse, to conceal all truth, to misuse all love, not only to suppress all passion, but worse still, to convert it into means for a social climate. The Parvenu is a Jewish newcomer to the general society who, because of the demands of the outside world, trades their most important attributes and instincts for material benefits. While we think of secular society as an open society that promotes individuals' freedoms, Arendt recognized the price Jews had to pay in order to join it. Assimilation was not a neutral process of transition from one society to another. The Parvenus sacrificed themselves, repressed their impulses so that society will accept them. Still, it was not only the outside world that posed such a danger to the Parvenu. Arendt's critique of Jewish modernity addressed more than Jewish assimilation. The initial condition of the Jews was just as problematic in our eyes. The Jewish Orthodox world, with its rules and regulations, was tyrannical and harmful, like the outside world. Arendt termed this condition, or unique Jewish conundrum, as double slavery. And apparently the Parvenu came up against an impasse. Either they were in the Jewish community and therefore adhering to the Jewish tradition, or they were outside the Jewish community by way of assimilation and thereby ruled by external persons. Importantly, it may seem that Arendt's analysis of assimilation engages with a marginal question in Jewish history. Yet, according to her, the transition from Judaism to the outside world was ubiquitous in the modern Jewish world. In the origins of totalitarianism, she explained. For the formation of a social history of the Jews within 19th century European society, it was, however, decisive that to a certain extent, every Jew in every generation had somehow, at some time, to decide whether he would remain a pariah and stay out of society altogether, or become a parvenu, or conform to society on the demoralizing condition that he not so much hide as a region. So, putting this in terms of crisis, the crisis of assimilation was, one, a crisis at the level of individual. Arendt is not interested in the destruction to the Jewish communities across Europe, but with the challenges of individuals. So one thing about this crisis, it's a crisis at the level of the individual. And two, the crisis of assimilation was basically the defining crisis of Jewish modernity. It was a decisive crisis that each and every Jew faced. Now, even if Arendt's claim about the pervasiveness of Jewish assimilation is somewhat of an exaggeration, I will give you that, we still need to see that, how she understands that, and this is how she understands it, and this needs to be said. So, in Verlagen books, the Jewish pariah seemed like a first solution to this problem. The pariahs, like the Parvenu, left traditional Judaism behind, yet, unlike the Parvenu, they did not join the outside world. They were in the liminal space between Judaism and Christianity, religion and secularity, and therefore free from the malefacts of both. So if originally the pariah is an expression of the Jewish historical crisis of the Galut, the pariah turns in Arendt into a solution for the crisis that she considered to be pivotal to Judaism in modernity. One could even say that she solves one crisis with another, the crisis of assimilation with the crisis of the pariah. Now, in order to do that, Arendt must offer a different understanding of the pariah condition, and this is exactly what she aims to do. Rather than suffering, Arendt claims that the pariah, for example, possesses, and this is her words, possesses more reality than the Parvenu. And elsewhere, Arendt connects this experience with autonomy. The pariah, precisely because he is an outcast, can see life as a whole and the very road upon which the pariah can attain to his great love of a free existence. It is offered to the pariah if, though unable to revolt as an individual against the whole society, he disdains the alternative of becoming a parvenu and is recompensed for his wretched situation by a view of the whole. The pariah in Arendt's imagination is free from the influence of both Jewish and secular society. It is therefore given a view of the whole. Arendt assigns to the Jewish pariah a scene and a vision with which they are able to pave their own road and achieve free existence. Now, Arendt's sincere admiration of the pariahs was not lost on her readers. Her biographer, Elizabeth Young Brule, notes that, and I quote it, Elizabeth now, the friends of every sort, and also the historical figures with whom Arendt felt special affinities like Rosa Luxemburg and Rachel Warenhagen had one characteristic in common. Each was, in his own way, an outsider. In Anna Arendt's personal lexicon, wirklich Menschen, real people. Real people. And there is actually a quote of Jasper writing to Anna. At one point later on, he writes to her, "You say that only pariahs are humans." So in fact, many saw in Arendt herself an important example of the Jewish pariahs, especially after the Eichmann controversy. So there are really quite a lot of works on Arendt as a pariah as Arendt. It's like go and Google it. There are plenty of it. And here we see how radical the argument is. The pariah was not just a solution to a crisis. The despised India's caste transformed in Arendt to a human ideal. Arendt thinks of Heine, Walter Benjamin, Kafka as pariah, the very best that modern culture offers. And before moving forward, I want to give us another example of how this structure appears in German Jewish context. And I think specifically on Freudian Oedipal complex. Now, Martha Robert, in a book about Freudian Judaism, suggests this wonderful idea that the Oedipus complex expresses the crisis of the modern Jewish world, especially the generational rupture between father and son in Jewish modernity. And think of Kafka's letter in this, to the father in this context as an example, in which the father is admired and hated, powerful and powerless. Well, the argument is that in this tension that Freud himself experienced find its way to Freud's work, especially to the Oedipus complex. And Kafka, actually, Kafka is the first to notice that, it writes as in this way. Psychoanalysis lays stress on the father complex, and many find the concept intellectually fruitful. In this case, I prefer another version, where the issue revolves not around the innocent father, but around the father Jewishness. So my argument is that, like Freud, who universalized in this reading the Jewish crisis into a psychological mechanism, Arendt universalizes the Jewish pariah to an ideal human status. Now, most commentators stop here. This despite of the fact that Arendt's description of the pariah is in essence much more multifaceted. The pariah, Arendt knows that this is very important in my mind, something like that. The pariah, she knows, does not voluntarily renounce. He can only assume required heroic poses after renunciation has been forced on him. The position of the pariah seemed to Arendt also involuntary. The pariahs are forced to live outside. They are induced to enjoy autonomy. It was not a conscious act of a certain intent that made one a pariah. In terms that Arendt would later develop in the human condition, we may thus argue that the pariah should be understood as a social phenomenon. The pariah does not hold a political position of a conscience agent. The pariah is rather an effect of social and religious forces. And in her 1944 essay, for example, Arendt presents Heinrich Heine's Schleimir as an important exemplar of this Jewish pariah. She writes in the following set: in the presence of such universal things as the sun, music, trees, and children, things which Rachel Warenhagen called the true realities, the petty dispensation of men which create and maintain inequality must necessarily appear ridiculous. Arendt certainly appreciated the naivety and simplicity of the sexual meals. However, she is also well aware of the disadvantages of the pariah position. The Shlemiel is an outsider who has no real interest in society. The Shlemiels relished in the sun and the trees, but they also disconnected from the world around them. The stakes of Arendt's model may be better pronounced a few years later in the origins of totalitarianism, where she linked the modern experience of ruthlessness and alienation of the masses with the rise of modern totalitarian regimes. Worldlessness was not an achievement for Arendt, but a political failure. The isolation and detachment that the figure of the pariah symbolizes were the very thing that endangered the public realm in Arendt's later works. The destruction of the common world, she explains in Human Condition, for example, her quote, can happen under condition of radical isolation, where nobody can no longer agree with anybody else, as is usually the case with tyrannies. So, on the face of it, Arendt's work on the Pariah reached an impasse. The isolated Pariah projected problematic political and elsewhere I argue that also ontological models, but in the Parvenu attempts to join the society is not less troubling. In Arendt's more developed work, the human condition is in this sense an attempt to move away from the deadlock that her individual-focused political theory brought about. Yet I would suggest that Arendt did find a temporary solution to these challenges in her Jew as a Pariah essay, which was originally published in 1944 with the Journal of Jewish Social Studies. In the essay, Arendt presents a slightly different version of the Pariah that is important to our discussion. She builds on the work of the French writer Gilad Sharvit to suggest the conscience Pariah. A witness to the Dreyfus affair, Lazar, like Arendt, was frustrated by the evident failure of Jewish assimilation. However, in contrast to the call of Herzl and others in the Zionist movement for national emancipation, Lazar envisioned a change in the Jewish people's relations with the European community. The Jews, he claimed, had to adopt the position of the Pariah consciously and willingly. The Pariah position should have been more than a random position that the Jews were forced to. It should have been the chosen position that would define their political role on the world stage. Lazar asked the Jews, as conscious pariahs, to utilize their liminal position on the borders of the European secular world in order to fight as political agents against the injustices they found around. In Arendt's world, as soon as a pariah enters the arena of politics and translates his status into political terms, he becomes perforce a rebel. Lazar and Arendt encourage the Jewish pariah to fight with the rest of the castaways and undesirables, to be their voice, to rebel against the forces that harm them and others. Every pariah who refused to be a rebel, Arendt warns, therefore, was partly responsible for his own position and therewith for the blot on mankind which it represented. And her own trajectory of that is thought is actually embedded in these two lines. Now, and with this I will finish. Going back to the theme of crisis, we see a different relation to crisis, to Jewish history. If initially Arendt glorified, we can modify it, but let's say glorified the Jewish pariah condition, as it was in the sense that it was accepted as a given, a fact, that she found to express certain foundational virtue. Now the relation of with the pariah condition is different. The pariahs need to take ownership of their pariah position and make use of this position. The pariah's position is still a fact. They are still outcasts. But now the pariah is not passive in its relations to this fact. The pariah condition is now a vocation, an important political vocation. It almost reminds Paul of the Messianic vocation. The change is not in the facts of one reality, but in how one engages with one reality and how one makes use of this reality. And it is here I argue that Arendt is relatively close to Rosenzweig and Hermann Cohen. The pariah is a vocation, similarly to the Messianic vocation in Rosenzweig and the ethical vocation in Cohen. And you probably heard that quite a lot, saying let's make lemonade out of lemons, and I think Arendt will agree with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilad.